Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea projected to see over 2,000 new COVID-19 infections on Wednesday. Once confirmed, it'll mark a big jump compared to previous days. US President Joe Biden re-engaging with ASEAN. He attends a virtual meeting of the 10-member group of Southeast Asian nations. Biden also pledges over $100 million to expand Washington's strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific region. Plus, with demand far outstripping supply, the price of crude oil trades at highs not seen since 2014. The price of one barrel now some $85, but analysts are projecting it could go much higher before demand starts to drop off.
Good morning and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on Wednesday, October 27th in Seoul, South Korea. I'm Kim Mo-gan.
And I'm Mark Broom. It's wonderful to have you with us as we head into the middle of the week. Over the next hour or so, we will be taking a look at the big news stories of the day and get some expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world.
Now we start with the latest on the coronavirus situation in South Korea. The nation is seeing an uptick in the number of new infections as we get to the week. Now with an easing of its restrictions ahead, it seems some people might be feeling complacent.
For more on this and other COVID-related updates, I'm glad to say we have our reporter Chae Min-jung in the studio with us. Good morning, Min-jung.
Good morning.
So let's start with the daily figure forecast for Wednesday. What are the estimates as of now?
Right, so we're expecting to see a big jump in the number of cases for Wednesday. More than 1,800 cases were confirmed from midnight to 9 p.m. yesterday. So today's tally will most likely be around 2,000. The weekend effect has officially come into play as cases usually begin to increase from Wednesday. But what's also attributing to the rise is people becoming more complacent as we get closer to next week's easing of restrictions.
Now, speaking of next week, we heard that people will need to show their vaccine pass in order to get into some certain places, such as, fitness centers and singing rooms. But what about people who haven't had their jabs?
Right, so people who have not yet gotten vaccinated, they will need a negative PCR test. So this also applies to those who have only received the first dose of a 2-dose vaccine like Pfizer's or Moderna's. Fully vaccinated people will also need a negative test if 2 weeks have not yet passed since their last shot. They must remember that they should get tested a maximum of 48 hours ahead of using the facilities. Regarding PCR tests, authorities are expecting a spike in the number of people getting tested as cases are expected to rise with many restrictions now lifted. To prevent an overload, they are considering charging for PCR tests needed to enter high-risk facilities. But for the time being, the test will remain free of charge. Besides this, there was also a confusion as to whether or not a vaccine pass is needed to enter hospitals. The authorities yesterday clarified that people will not need it when going to see the doctor. However, vaccine passes will be mandatory for those visiting or looking after patients.
Okay, so that's the situation as it stands in South Korea. But a lot of us are thinking about international travel now that the vast majority of people in South Korea have been fully vaccinated. How's that looking?
Right, so the United States recently bumped up its travel advisory for South Korea to level 3. So this level means that people visiting from the U.S. should reconsider travel to South Korea. The second toughest level in the scheme indicates that there is a high level of COVID-19 in the country. The level was bumped up from level 1 to level 2 in August when the pandemic worsened in South Korea. For South Koreans entering the States, they will now need a vaccine pass. Currently, only negative test results are required. However, the measures have been strengthened as the U.S. will only allow fully vaccinated people with a negative PCR test to enter the country starting November 8th. Meanwhile, the WHO Emergency Committee insists that countries should not require a proof of vaccination as the only condition for international travel. They recommended making changes to testing or quarantine measures instead, as many countries do not have equal access to vaccines.
Now, Min-jung, we're also hearing that more vaccines produced in South Korea are set to be distributed this week. Tell us more on that.
Right, so Moderna vaccines developed by Samsung Biologics will be distributed in the country in the coming weeks. And some 2.4 million doses will be used in the country to vaccinate people in the fourth quarter. Up until now, Moderna vaccines administered in the country were manufactured overseas from countries like the U.S. and Europe. This is the second domestically produced COVID-19 vaccine given to Koreans after AstraZeneca's vaccine produced by SK Bioscience was distributed in February. South Korea is solidifying its position as a global vaccine hub as Samsung Biologics plans on delivering Moderna's vaccine across the globe as well.
Okay, now thank you, Min-jung, for your report. I will talk to you with more updates, hopefully, in our next newscast.
Thank you.
Thank you as always, Min-jung. Now, moving on to other news, South Korea and Southeast Asian countries have reaffirmed their commitment to overcome the pandemic together and focus on an inclusive and sustainable future. At the latest round of ASEAN meetings Tuesday, South Korean President Moon Jae-in proposed boosting healthcare cooperation.
He also said Seoul will provide extra funds to speed up vaccine distribution in Southeast Asia. Our senior Blue House correspondent Kim Min-ji reports.
President Moon Jae-in has proposed establishing a healthcare and vaccine initiative between South Korea and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Moon took part in an online summit Tuesday with ASEAN's 10-member countries. The Blue House says the initiative would be aimed at expanding production capacity of vaccines and treatments while ensuring fair distribution. He also pledged an additional $5 million this year to a fund set up by ASEAN to speed up the distribution of coronavirus vaccines in the region and to contribute to the members' economic recovery. South Korea has been an active participant in ASEAN's COVID-19 response fund and the region's reserve of medical supplies.
우리는 코로나 극복과 더 나은 회복을 위해 더 깊은 우정을 나누어야 합니다. 최근 백신 보급률이 낮은 지역을 중심으로 델타 변이가 퍼지고 빈번한 생산 차질로 세계 경제 회복이 제약받고 있습니다. 백신이 부족한 나라의 어려움은 그렇지 않은 나라의 어려움으로 연결되고 결국 연대와 협력만이 코로나 극복의 길이라는 것을 증명하고 있습니다.
Moon said South Korea places high importance on ties with ASEAN and that it plans to work together to overcome the pandemic and create an inclusive and sustainable future. South Korea and ASEAN have stepped up cooperation since 2017, when Moon unveiled his new southern policy to boost ties with the region. During the meeting, Moon also called for ASEAN to support a swift resumption of dialogue with North Korea for lasting peace and complete denuclearization on the Korean peninsula. In a joint statement, the leaders agreed to advance their strategic partnership into one that's more substantial and mutually beneficial to better respond to regional and global opportunities and challenges and contribute to enhancing peace and prosperity. On Wednesday, President Moon will attend the ASEAN Plus 3 summit along with the leaders of Japan and China, which will be followed by the East Asia Summit. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
For the first time in 4 years, the leaders of the United States had joined his ASEAN counterparts for a summit. During the talks held virtually on Tuesday, President Joe Biden underscored the importance of U.S.-ASEAN ties. The engagement is seen as part of Washington's efforts to exert collective efforts against China's growing influence. Kim Hyo-san reports.
On Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden took part in a virtual summit with the leaders of ASEAN for the first time in 4 years that Washington has engaged at the top level with the regional bloc. This comes as President Biden is seeking to intensify U.S. presence in the Pacific as China continues to emerge as a national security and economic adversary. Biden said his administration plans to provide up to $102 million to the bloc for regional development, stressing that Washington's relationship with ASEAN is a linchpin for maintaining resilience, prosperity, and the security of the region.
In fact, we intend to launch a new program and initiatives to enhance our cooperation across the range of issues, totaling more than $100 million. Our bottom line is that ASEAN is essential. I want to say that is essential to the regional architecture of the Indo-Pacific.
The fund will include spending for health and welfare, a new climate initiative, as well as other programs to help ASEAN countries recover from the pandemic. Myanmar was not allowed to attend as the group banned its military junta leader for ignoring the bloc's roadmap for peace that was agreed upon 6 months ago. However, the other leaders shared their concerns over Myanmar's worsening crisis. President Biden denounced a military coup for its use of, quote, horrific violence against protesters. He added the U.S. will focus on sending support for the people of Myanmar for its democratic path, as well as for the protection of safety, security, and human rights. On Wednesday, President Biden will join the broader East Asia Summit, which brings together ASEAN and other nations in the Indo-Pacific region. Kim Yo-san, Arirang News.
South Korea's trade volume is projected to have already surpassed $1 trillion for the year. Now, that's the fastest it's ever reached that milestone for a year, and there are still more than 2 months left to go in 2021. With the global economy recovering from the pandemic, South Korea's exports have been performing strongly. Chang Tae-hyun tells us more.
South Korea's annual trade volume for this year reached the $1 trillion mark on Tuesday, 299 days after the year began. The Trade Ministry said on Tuesday that this figure was reached in record time after the country first started compiling trade data in 1956.
As the coronavirus situation is settling down and countries are trading again, there are many reasons behind the rise in exports, like an increase in GDP or consumer prices.
The record comes as the global economy recovers from the pandemic and after an increase in exports of semiconductors, petrochemicals, autos, steel, and smartphones. In particular, South Korea recorded its highest sales in memory chips in the second quarter. If this trend continues, trade volume for this year may even surpass the record of $1.14 trillion that was achieved in 2018. As of October 26th, trade volume in exports is at $512 billion, and for imports, it's close to $488 billion. To put the figure into perspective, $1 trillion is the price of around 50 million Hyundai Avante sedans. The country's yearly trade volume has hit the 1 trillion mark 7 times. For the whole of last year, the figure was at 980 billion due to impact of the pandemic. The total amount of exports of small and medium-sized businesses in January to September was at over $85 billion. This record-breaking amount comes after a rising popularity of K-culture and more people buying Korean cosmetics and home appliances. Chang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
South Korea's consumer sentiment improved in October even as the country grapples with COVID-19. According to the Bank of Korea on Wednesday, the composite consumer sentiment index rose to 106.8 this month, up 3 points from September. The central bank said ramped up vaccinations strengthened consumer confidence for the second consecutive month. A reading above 100 indicates there are more optimists than pessimists about the economy. The price of crude oil hit a 7-year high on Tuesday, fueled by a global supply shortage and skyrocketing demand in the United States. Brent futures rose 41 cents to settle at over $86 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate ended 1.1% higher at $84.65. These are the highest closes since October 2014 for both the global benchmarks. The rise comes as OPEC Plus continues to rebuff calls to boost output. However, some traders say the potential resumption of nuclear talks with Iran could potentially lead to more crude becoming available. Now we switch our attention to On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. Countries around the world are saddled with rampant inflation and rising prices at the pump. South Korea is suffering from the same issues. Consumer prices in South Korea jumped more than 2% for the 6th straight month in September, and growth in the third quarter was rather underwhelming, to say the least. Also on Tuesday, South Korean officials said fuel taxes will be slashed by a record 20% for half a year from mid-November in a bid to cope with skyrocketing energy prices.
Now, for a closer look, we connect to Stephen Borowick, who's a writer, journalist, and broadcaster based in Seoul. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, as Mark just mentioned, inflation and high gasoline prices aren't problems exclusive to South Korea. Now, this is happening worldwide. And since three major catalysts are outside South Korea's control, namely OPEC's decisions on oil production, the Federal Reserve's hints about tapering, and the pandemic, is there much officials at the national level can do at this point to keep a lid on inflation?
Well, as Mark mentioned, this rising inflation is particularly challenging in that it's coming during a period of slow growth. So governments customarily at times of slow growth will try to pump liquidity into the market, and they'll try to encourage spending and encourage consumption that way. But in this case, we're seeing this, the South Korean government has been using those tools, but those tools are kind of limited in the current economic landscape. So the government is definitely limited when it comes to affecting oil prices. Oil prices are expected to continue rising. They are likely to get as high as $90 a barrel. I've seen some projections, but what the government is doing is using the tools that they have at their disposal. And, the government obviously can control taxation. So they're doing what they can to try to keep inflation steady and also encourage consumption at the same time. So it's a complicated economic calculus that they have in front of them right now.
Yeah, I think I read a report this morning saying that Goldman Sachs, their projection is actually well over $100 a barrel before things start to come down a bit. But I wanted to get your take on this decision to slash not only gasoline, but diesel and LPG taxes, considering it was a cut of 20%. That's a record deduction we've seen here in this country. Does that suggest to you perhaps that behind closed doors, not to the public at least, South Korean officials are starting to get really worried that this could quickly spin out of control and derail any chance, any hope of a post-pandemic recovery?
It shows that they're taking things very seriously, and it shows that they're being proactive, which are good things. I think to some extent this tax cut is intended to assist kind of vulnerable members of the economy, people who have to drive to work every day, and small and medium manufacturers. A lot of the Korean economy, not just in terms of production, but in terms of employment, takes place at smaller manufacturers and smaller businesses that are sensitive to, that have smaller profit margins and are sensitive to any kind of change in energy costs or any other shifts in the economic landscape more broadly. I think we also have to keep in mind the political context. The South Korean government is up for election in March of next year, and so they're going to want to have some decent economic numbers to show for when South Koreans go to the polls. So I think that's at least part of their motivation, and they want to be able to show to the world that the economy is going well and things are moving along and things are really recovering. And I think that's also another reason why they are willing to do something like cutting a tax, which can result in less government revenue and a higher level of government debt, because they're kind of looking ahead to the medium-term future and perhaps not the more long-term future of fiscal soundness.
And Stephen, earlier this week, President Moon Jae-in was at the National Assembly to urge lawmakers to approve his administration's record $520 billion budget for 2022. How will rising prices impact the president's big spending proposals, and how are they proposing to pay for this? Is it through higher taxes or more debt?
As of now, this government is racking up quite a lot of debt. I just yesterday there was a pretty scathing editorial in the Donga Ilbo where they accused the Moon Jae-in administration of kind of one expert that I spoke to described what the government's doing is kind of borrowing growth from the future. Right now they're spending very heavily and they're trying to prop up the economy, and that's going to create some limitations for whoever the next government is. If it's the opposition, then they'll face some difficult decisions as to needing to cut spending and then needing to absorb any kind of lower economic growth that comes with that. If it's the current ruling party, if they win re-election, they will have to change what they have been doing customarily over the past 4.5-5 years, is that they've spent very aggressively. They've tried to prop up less competitive or less advanced sectors of the economy. Throughout the pandemic, they've been quite generous with cash payments to vulnerable people meant to spur consumption. And all of that has been, mostly the record on that is mixed, but we can say that at the very least, it's kept South Korea from falling into any kind of sustained recession. There has been growth. The economy has remained in positive territory. And that's all well and good. And I think all of this backdrop is one reason why the Moon administration is now quite keen to lift social distancing measures and get the economy going again and get domestic consumption back up to the point where the economy can be growing in a more organic way and in a less state-led sort of way.
Yeah, and just finally, just getting back to the oil prices. Now, I don't want to be too doom and gloom about this, but this is like the worst case scenario, really, considering that many nations, including South Korea, are kind of facing this double-edged sword right now. The rising energy prices on one side, but also a rallying US dollar, and that is the currency, of course, in which crude oil is denominated in. Do you think policymakers are concerned that this is creating a kind of perfect storm that could potentially tip smaller but still pretty mid-sized economies like South Korea's into full-blown recession?
Well, I'll try to give a less doomy take on that. The optimistic take on this is that oil prices, they are likely to keep rising, but hopefully this will spur some higher production, not by OPEC, but by some more independent producers. It could also spur some, the government in this country is very keen to move to other forms of energy. It could spur some innovation on that front. And at the same time, there's the reason for optimism in Korea is that, what's really driving these oil prices is recovery of global demand. As economies are opening up, people are moving around again, and there's a greater demand for energy. So that's a kind of little bit of context that I think we should keep in mind. But I think for the medium term future, I think the South Korea's economic prospects, despite the challenges that you mentioned, are sound, just for the fact that if you look at the past year and a half, we've been dealing with some very strict social distancing. Global demand has been tampered down by a variety of factors. But now we're opening up again, and people are going to be going out more and looking to purchase more. The holiday season is coming, which is always a time of increased consumption. So there are definitely some challenges, but let's try to remain somewhat optimistic.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Great to speak to you again. That was Stephen Borg, a Seoul-based journalist on the rising inflation and spiking gasoline prices in South Korea.
Thank you.
It appears the U.S. and South Korea are not entirely on the same page when it comes to re-engaging North Korea in dialogue. Speaking on Tuesday, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that while Washington and Seoul agree on the need to engage with North Korea diplomatically, they have different ideas on what the conditions should be and when talks should resume. Sullivan made the comment after he was asked whether the White House also thought declaring an end to the 1950 to 53 Korean War could help the diplomatic process move forward. The South Korean government insists such a declaration would likely have the desired effect. South Korea's top security officials admits it's difficult to identify whether North Korea can mount nuclear warheads on its new short-range missiles. National Security Advisor Seo Hoon on Tuesday said the North is presumably trying to reduce their size and weight based on the regime's recent test launches. North Korea fired a submarine-launched ballistic missile earlier this month and a new hypersonic missile in September. To that, Seo said South Korea's military has the capability to counter any new missiles the North is currently developing.
South Korea's Foreign Minister Jong Yong will meet Wednesday with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov for talks on bilateral issues and Korean Peninsula affairs during their sit-down in Moscow. They're likely to discuss ways to bolster South Korea-Russia ties and pathways to restart the Korean peace process. The agenda also includes regional and global issues. They'll also attend a cultural event commemorating 30 years of their diplomatic ties. Chung's trip to Russia follows Lavrov's visit here in March. No Tae-woo, South Korea's last general-turned president, died on Tuesday at the age of 88. From 1988 to 1993, No played a role in a bloody crackdown on pro-democracy protesters, but also ensured Seoul won its bid to host the 1988 Olympics. Our Kim Young-sung takes a look back at his life.
Former South Korean President Roh Tae-woo was born in 1932 in a small mountainside village in Daegu. He didn't stand out much as a child, nor did he excel academically. But when he first joined the military in 1950 as the Korean War broke out, he took his first step toward what later led to his presidency. In 1951, he joined the Korean Military Academy, a prestigious institution that fosters elite military personnel. There, he befriended Chun Doo-hwan, who would later become the infamous South Korean dictator who overthrew the government in a coup in 1979 and ordered a military crackdown on protesters, killing several hundreds. All the while, Roh Tae-woo stood by Chun's side as his closest aide. Roh was due to be named as Chun's successor, but then the June struggle broke out, with nationwide uproar calling for democratic reforms. Roh Tae-woo had no choice but to push for democratic change. In 1987, he and his party members drafted a new constitution, which included the provision to change the presidential election into a direct election by popular vote. During the election campaign, odds seemed to be stacked against Roh, with many voicing their distaste for his ties to the Chun administration. But Roh campaigned himself as an average Joe, and he went on to win, albeit by a slim margin with 36% of the votes. From 1988 to 1993, Roh strived to achieve peace with North Korea and carved out friendly diplomatic relationships with many countries as South Korea's 13th president. But in 1995, 2 years after his term had ended, there were allegations of him illegally obtaining public funds. He was subsequently arrested and tried on charges of corruption, along with mutiny and treason for his past involvement with dictator Chun Doo-hwan. The Supreme Court sentenced him to 17 years in prison, but in 1997 he was pardoned by President Kim Young-sam upon the request of President-elect Kim Dae-jung. With his life having come to an end at age 88, Roh Tae-woo remains one of the most controversial yet influential figures in South Korean political history. He laid the groundwork for the democratic nation that South Korea is today, but also orchestrated military crackdowns. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Now we cross over to our Oh Se-young for global insights and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you, Morgan. It's time for Global Insight, where we connect to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Now, South Korean President Moon Jae-in is, of course, taking part in a virtual summit with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations this week. And under the theme, We Care, We Prepare and We Prosper, the 10-member regional bloc is to discuss fighting the COVID-19 pandemic and promoting economic recovery. But there's a great amount of attention on whether ASEAN countries will address the geopolitical challenges that have been mounting in recent months. And of course, these include the democratic crisis in Myanmar and tensions in the South China Sea, as well as the United States and China's rivalry in the region. We address these questions over ASEAN's capacity to unite and respond to the changing dynamics of the region. And for this, we are joined by Erwin Tan, Associate Professor at Hangul University of Foreign Studies. Very warm welcome to you. And well, to kick things off, the annual summit began with drama, really, as Myanmar's representative didn't show up in protest over the regional bloc's exclusion of the country's top military general. And of course, to add some context there, Myanmar has been under the rule of a junta which staged a coup in February this year, overthrowing the Aung San Suu Kyi's democratically elected government. Well, are you expecting any extensive discussions or concrete actions to come out of the summit regarding Myanmar?
Hello, good morning, and my thanks for this invitation to participate in the discussion. Now, I anticipate that there would be some fairly comprehensive attempts to broker a diplomatic deal at this summit. I think it should be noted that for the first time, we're talking about ASEAN actually banning the Myanmar government from actually attending the summit, which is a step they haven't taken before. And the fact that you've got Biden condemning the government in Myanmar over its suppression of the pro-democracy movement. So this is essentially creating a lot of pressure to adopt a tough diplomatic statement on Myanmar. But that's only insofar as attempts to broker a diplomatic deal are concerned. The shortfall will be in the area of concrete action. ASEAN countries have long feared the prospect of foreign meddling in their internal affairs. Also, if the US is seen as acting too strongly against the Tatmadaw regime, they might actually run the risk of convincing wavering ASEAN countries to distance themselves from the US.
And while the democratic crisis in Myanmar, it's been considered something of a litmus test for ASEAN's effectiveness and its claim of being a rules-based and people-centered regional organisation. And many think that it hasn't been doing enough and that its policy of non-intervention is rather irresponsible. What's your opinion on this?
Well, from one perspective, it's particularly my own as an ASEAN, as a citizen of an ASEAN country, I do agree that the current ASEAN way is irresponsible in the sense that it basically marks the legacy of its old 1960s mindset. But if you then think in terms of another perspective, namely the contextual backdrop that saw the founding of ASEAN in the 1960s in the first place. Well, bear in mind that during the 1960s, you had fears of regional conflict within the countries, newly independent countries in Southeast Asia, and the Vietnam War was in full swing. So in that sense, compared to that backdrop, you can see it might be possible to argue that ASEAN is actually a bit of a qualified success as far as mitigating full-scale conflict between its members are concerned. The main limitation, as you pointed out then, is in how ASEAN can remain relevant for the foreseeable future, because you're talking about attempting to address policy issues that go beyond traditional interstate rivalry. In other words, the need to move beyond the existing 1960s mindset is where ASEAN will face a lot of challenges.
Right, and in the face of these challenges, in addition to the question of relevance, there have also been questions over its ability to respond in a joint fashion. And we haven't seen a joint Southeast Asian response to the Australia-UK-US Pact, which aims to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. And of course, their reactions have varied considerably. While Singapore and Vietnam seem to back the initiative, Malaysia and Indonesia, they've warned that the agreement might actually trigger an arms race and undermine regional stability. What's your opinion on this?
I think the claims of an arms race have been somewhat overblown. I mean, all of the countries that you mentioned in ASEAN and outside of ASEAN have their own submarine programs and other arms acquisitions programs. It's part of the routine process of military modernization that all countries do all the time. But again, that's being qualified. An arms race, including a nuclear one, is a possibility in the event that either Australia or Japan go beyond just new submarines and end up developing nuclear warheads. Because if that happens, then, well, that's the kind of situation that might happen in the event that either country has reason to doubt the credibility of their nuclear-armed patrons.
And would you say that initiatives like Quad, which not only focuses on well, it's an informal alliance, of course, but it focuses on infrastructure, economic cooperation, vaccine production, all sorts of non-traditional security areas, and then there's also AUKUS. Does this really affect or does it undermine the centrality of ASEAN?
Well, I think the increased prominence of Quad does have the potential to undermine the centrality of ASEAN, because don't forget that none of the ASEAN members are represented in Quad, and only Vietnam is a Quad Plus member. So in that sense, yes, I think there's one area that ASEAN has to take into account, the fact that, adhering to its old 1960s mindset might run the risk of rendering itself irrelevant into the mid-21st century.
Well, it looks like President Biden might have some explaining to do to his Southeast Asian partners. And well, this was actually Biden's first meeting with Southeast Asian leaders as president. Would you say it's meaningful that he led the US delegation to the ASEAN Virtual Summit compared to former leader Donald Trump, who skipped the summit in 2017?
Well, I think it indicates that the Biden administration recognizes that it has to shore up partnerships with ASEAN countries against China. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Part of this is the necessity of Biden having to salvage the US soft power image since leaving the chaos of the Trump administration. Now, in this sense, the Biden administration has a number of things going for it. For instance, the success of the US-made Pfizer vaccine can allow the Biden administration to salvage some level of US soft power in the eyes of the international community. But elsewhere, and even before the Trump administration, I think it's interesting that several countries in Southeast Asia already had their own concerns about the implications of the rise of Chinese military power and have already been modernizing their military. Don't forget that Obama lifted the arms embargo on Vietnam. And the US, under Obama, Trump, and Biden, has also been stepping up the level of its own security cooperation with several countries in ASEAN, not just Vietnam, but also Singapore for decades, but also the Philippines and Indonesia, where in terms of joint security training exercises, new military establishments and facilities, and arms sales.
And how do you think the Biden administration is going to try and engage ASEAN countries amid Washington's rivalry with Beijing?
Well, and I think it's going to be a combination of hard and soft power. Soft power in terms of a promotion of the US-made Pfizer vaccine, which can allow the US to portray itself as a provider of public goods. Hard power in terms of, as I pointed out, the stepping up and increase joint military exercises with ASEAN countries, especially Singapore, which the US has an informal security relationship with, as well as further arms sales to help assuage regional fears of the implications of great power or conflict.
And well, much like South Korea, for most Southeast Asian countries, their largest trading partner is China. So it's been very challenging for them to really respond to this intensifying rivalry between the two great economic powers. And well, how has China's rise and its assertiveness in the South China Sea and the Mekong River tested the solidarity of ASEAN countries?
Well, actually, it's already tested it even for decades earlier. Because one thing that China's been doing is to engage in economics-based influence operations, placing increased amounts of infrastructure aid and investment in various developing countries in expectation for a regional quid pro quo being granted to Beijing's interest. So consider the fact that you've got Cambodia blocking ASEAN attempts to raise the stage of the South China Sea, clear quid pro quo being offered to Beijing. But I think that was pretty much in the pre-2020 phase. Now, considering the extent to which the COVID-19 has put the spotlight on China's track record of global governance, especially the fact that the municipal authorities in Wuhan tried to cover up the pandemic in the first place, the fact that China's been supplying low-quality ventilators and masks to other countries, has also further dented China's soft power image. Now, I would say that a number of countries are clearly and firmly in the Chinese camp and will likely remain so for the foreseeable future. But other countries, the Quad members that I mentioned, several countries in ASEAN, especially Vietnam and Indonesia, are also moving away from China, although the extent to which they are willing to sign up to a US-led containment of China is also up for question. In this sense, a lot will also depend on the specific nature of US attempts to contain China.
Well, ASEAN countries, well, they wanted to be at the center of all Southeast Asian affairs, of course, but until now as it is in the case of many so-called middle powers, we've seen a lot of feel-good statements, words like co-prosperity and cooperation. But can ASEAN actually go beyond issuing statements and simply reacting to regional dynamics to actually shaping them?
Well, I think ASEAN can attempt to shape some of these regional dynamics, but its ability to do so is itself dependent on cooperating with the great powers, because ASEAN members on their own, or even ASEAN as a collective, has limited diplomatic willpower and clout. Now, I think it might be helpful for a start, for ASEAN to move beyond its old 1960s mindset that was so obsessed with the prospect of foreign meddling in their internal affairs. So in this sense, addressing the situation in Myanmar would be a good start. I think efforts to address common issues, shared ASEAN issues such as these, seeking stability in the South China Sea is also a worthy area, even as certain members of ASEAN are balking at this. Now, I think a further area that ASEAN should also attempt to explore as a sort of a diplomatically low-cost move is to address issues of shared global concern, which do not involve any explicit political costs. So, for instance, things like the issues of plastic and garbage dumping at sea, or local initiatives to promote low carbon emissions energy sources, such as solar and wind power, are the kind of low-cost initiatives that can help ASEAN to consolidate its position.
And do you see any ways that perhaps South Korea could share in that, ways that South Korea and ASEAN countries could work together to increase multilateralism and promote global norms in the region?
Well, I think if we extend this from my earlier point about non-explicit forms of geostrategic rivalry as a low-cost means of addressing shared global issues. So in this sense, the ROK has a good start. It has a very largely positive image in many countries in ASEAN due to its pattern of rapid economic development during the 20th century, the kind of track record that many developing countries in Southeast Asia actually like to emulate. Moreover, I think the track record of 3 countries in particular, not just the ROK, but one ASEAN country, Singapore, and also Taiwan, are extremely interesting in addressing, and how they address the COVID-19 crisis, offer lessons that other countries around the world might attempt to emulate. Now, Moon Jae-in is expected to leave office shortly, so I think it's going to be up for the debate over the implication, the type of policy towards Southeast Asia that is practiced in the period up from 2022 onwards. But I think in the event that we can continue the existing principles of Moon Jae-in's New Southern policy, in the event that it takes a similar form under Moon's successor, it does offer the potential of a win-win solution. Because if you think in terms of providing the ROK with opportunities to promote aspects of its economic modernization model to developing countries in ASEAN. And so in this sense, I think it's quite notable that Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam are particularly valuable opportunities for South Korean economic investment, if you think in terms of low labor costs, as well as highly literate workforces.
And do you think, well, before he leaves office, President Moon Jae-in will be able to see some progress on his New Southern policy that you just mentioned?
Personally, I doubt so. The members of ASEAN are very diverse in terms of their levels of political and economic development. Not only that, if you also consider the extent of the disruption resulting from COVID-19, it's extremely severe disruption, so much so that it's essentially set back attempts to promote economic cooperation. Now, that being said, though, it's not a failure of the New Southern policy. I think it's more helpful to see the New Southern policy as a medium to long-term initiative that will take time to bear fruit.
And well, this is all we have time for today, but that was Erwin Tan, Associate Professor at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Another enormous IPO is on the horizon for the South Korean stock market. This time, it's the fintech company Kakao Pay. Given that it's an extremely high-profile and universally known brand in Korea, competition over the 2-day pre-order period was especially fierce. Ji-young reports.
The fintech company Kakao Pay, affiliated with the country's largest smartphone chat application, Kakao, will debut on the country's benchmark Kospi next week on November 3rd. Ahead of the IPO, the 2-day pre-order for retail investors took place this Monday and Tuesday. Investors raced to get their hands on Kakao Pay shares, pouring about $5 billion into retail orders. Submitted orders came to around 30 times the amount of stocks made available. Each retail investor will be able to get an average of 2.3 shares. Interest is high as Kakao Pay is the country's largest mobile payment service and has more than 20 million users.
I came to the branch because of the Kakao Pay pre-IPO bidding. We talk using Kakao app, and we use Kakao Pay whenever we transfer money online. I believe most people in South Korea use the service, and it's becoming more common. So I thought owning Kakao Pay shares could lead to a profit. I'm thinking of bidding for 100 shares today.
But this time, unlike other companies, the share allocation method will be different. Kakao Pay will be the first company in South Korea to distribute its stocks ahead of the IPO with an equal chance for all retail subscribers who deposit the minimum amount.
This time, 100% of shares allotted for retail investors are distributed with an equal chance. So I believe that it is unlikely that I get more shares even if I put more money in. So I just deposited the money for 20 shares, which is the minimum amount.
This measure is likely to enable as many retail investors to own Kakao Pay shares. The company also took orders from institutional investors last week, and it was oversubscribed by a factor of more than 1,700. With the fierce competition, many are expecting the share price to jump shortly after trading begins. But some experts say, 따상, a local market slang term describing the share opening at more than twice the IPO price and hitting the daily upper limit of 30% above the opening price, is not likely for Kakao Pay.
Currently, the financial market is going through a slow period. The price of KakaoBank shares fell to double on the first day of trading. Kakao Pay is likely to go through similar phases in the early days of trading.
He added, even with the IPO, it is important for the investors to pay attention to the fundamentals and the potential long-term growth of the firm rather than selling it in the early days of trading. 엄지영, Arirang News.
Asia recorded its hottest year on record in 2020, and research shows the extreme weather is taking a toll on development across the continent. According to the UN's weather agency, on Tuesday, the mean temperature in Asia in 2020 was almost 1.4 degrees Celsius above the 1981 to 2010 average. It added the extreme weather killed thousands of people, displaced millions more, and cost economies hundreds of billions of dollars. South Korea suffered an estimated economic loss of $24 billion. China suffered Asia's biggest loss at $238 billion.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. According to Iran's state media on Tuesday, a cyber attack disrupted the sale of heavily subsidized gas, causing long lines at gas stations across the country.
In the last 4 hours, I've gone to 15 different places, and I still have not been able to get gas. And I've been standing here for 4 hours. We're waiting for the system to connect, and it still has not connected.
The chaos comes just weeks ahead of the anniversary of street protests in 2019 that followed fuel price hikes. The country says it's on high alert for online attacks, which has blamed on the U.S. and Israel in the past. The oil ministry says only sales for those with smart cards used for cheaper ration gas were disrupted, adding clients could still buy fuel at higher rates. The last cyber attack against Iran came in July, when the website of the transport ministry was taken down by what its state media called a cyber disruption. A first-of-its-kind proposal from Democratic lawmakers is set to be unveiled soon and would require roughly 700 U.S. billionaires to pay taxes annually when their stock and some other assets increase in value. Currently, such taxes are only applied when stocks are sold. So how will taxing the rich change if the proposal is passed? If you own $1 billion share of a company at the start of the year and the price of the stock soars 50% by the end of the year, you would have $500 million of income subject to the new proposed tax, despite not selling a single share. But who will be most affected by this new proposal? Currently, the wealthiest 10 Americans own roughly $1.3 trillion, and the so-called Wyden plan would require them to pay a combined $276 billion in taxes. Among those in the highest tiers are Tesla CEO Elon Musk and former Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. However, tax and legal experts say if the proposal is passed, it will likely face an immediate challenge in court by taxpayers eager to evade the rules. In a low-key ceremony lacking the usual traditional rituals, Japan's Princess Mako married her university sweetheart Kei Komuro on Tuesday. While it should have been a joyous day for the two, the couple voiced their sadness over the controversy that haunted their engagement. Since announcing their engagement in 2017, the two faced tabloid scandals and vicious online attacks over allegations that Komoro's family had run into financial difficulties. A recent poll conducted by a Japanese weekly magazine, Arirang, in September showed that over 93% of the respondents were against Mako getting married to a commoner. Despite this, Mako chose love overall, giving up her royal title, as well as a $1.35 million payment usually offered to royal women who leave the royal palace. 이승재, Arirang News.
Good morning. We have a very unwelcome guest today. It's ultrafine dust from overseas, which is affecting the Korean peninsula for the first time this season. Dust levels in the west and Gyeongsang-Pukto province are already high, and it could increase to very bad levels during the day, so be sure to have a face mask that can block fine dust today. Fog is getting thicker, while south of Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do provinces could see some light passing rain during the first half of the day. Low temperatures are higher than yesterday, about 5 degrees higher than the same time yesterday here in the capital. But we are covered with toxic dust this morning. The skies will be bright but will be blurred by dust, and highs will be as high as yesterday's, are going up to 18 degrees Celsius, Daegu, Gyeongju at 21 degrees. Air quality, though, will return to normal tomorrow, thankfully, and we'll enjoy more fine late autumn weather for the time being. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
Well, that's where we are going to have to wrap up this Wednesday edition of New Day at Arirang. Thank you for spending the past hour with us. I'm Mark Broom.
And I'm Kim Mo-Gan. Mark will be back in an hour with more news, and both of us will be here at the same time on Thursday for another edition of New Day at Arirang. Goodbye.